3D Lab guest sessions are online technical talks or collaborative workshops with external practitioners or our in-house technical team. These sessions are hosted by the 3D Lab based at Wimbledon College of Arts, UAL. We seek conversations that reflect the richness of thinking through making, technical research and development, and practical learning and teaching. We aim to explore the making literacies that underpin making practice, and in doing so develop a learning resource within the context of performance and beyond. For previous sessions and to join our mailing list, please visit wca3dlab.myblog.arts.ac.uk. Hello and welcome to 3D Lab guest sessions. My name is Ashley Pearson and I help run the 3D Lab at Wimbledon College of Arts, UAL. The 3D Lab has enjoyed lively and pertinent discussions about making and the making environment with site-specific performance and installation makers Forster and Heighes, before, during and after their recent residency at Wimbledon called Trigpoint. If you'd like to find out more about their residency, head to arts.ac.uk. We're excited to share with you a continuation of these conversations, and in particular how they use the language and practice of making to shape and compositionally inform their work. I've since contributed to a podcast created by Chris and Ewan, reflecting upon their residency at Wimbledon and our conversations together, as well as the potential that making environments have to offer performance education, and in particular our new performance courses at Wimbledon. I'll be posting that podcast episode wherever you find these sessions. Ewan Forster and Christopher Heighes have more than 25 years experience of developing new methodologies of performance in relation to the built environment, as well as exploring the performative potential of tools and things, the delight of encountering materials by way of neglected or abandoned craft skills, and the fragile economy that is thinking through doing. They talk about how the volatile and mutable energies of a successful making environment, the workshop, can be translated into performance. To which brings me the greatest pleasure to welcome Chris and Ewan. It's just been wonderful to talk to these guys about how they approach making and how they think through the making environment, and just how making informs design, informs relationships, informs the way they work with people. Chris is hailing from Elephant Castle in London, and Ewan's joining us from France, so we've got a little bit of a international linkage happening as well at the same time. Over to you guys.
Well, thanks. Yes, I'm Ewan Forster. This is Chris. That's Chris Heighes, and we've been working together a long time, 30 odd years now, nearly. What we thought we would do today is just, rather than go through the theatre projects as such that we've been making, performance projects, installation projects, about the material itself, we would just concentrate a little bit more on Ash's brief, which was to really think about how we use making as a methodology, very important part of the methodology of creating the works that we do. And so to that point, to that end, we put together a PowerPoint presentation, which I'm going to do my best to share with you. Chris, did you want to add anything on the introduction front while I try and get this thing?
No, that's fine. I can chat as we go along.
We'll start here. As you can see underneath there here, we're sharing this in the PowerPoint presentation mode because we thought it might be helpful. At least you can see what's sort of coming up. You can see a sort of variety of slides here. What we thought we'd do is we would take, say, three of the larger projects that we've done over the last 20 years or so, and look at them. We're going to begin with a project called Curriculum, which moved on into another one called Middle English, which had some quite particular making going on in it. And then we're going to move on to some installations we made, one in Liverpool at the Cathedral in Liverpool, and finish up with another installation we made at Somerset House, and also the work that we made for you at Wimbledon. So Chris, we'll start here. This is Chris's dad's shed. I just want to do a little introduction about the shed. Over to you, Chris.
We're just going to start with an image of my dad's shed, which is maybe a bit representative of my state of mind at the moment, and certainly representative of his personality. This was the shed which I had to clear shortly after his death, and it's sort of representative of our relationship with materials and starting. sort of one of the hardest things we have as artists is beginning. Just quite how you begin work. Often it's bewildering to sit with a plain sheet of paper or an empty screen. And for us as performance makers, we believe that sort of performance, we're constantly in performance. How you choose to dress, how you choose to interact with the world, how the world interacts with you, larger institutions, how you choose to cook, drive, everything is in a state of performance. And performance exists in time and space. And beginning work when that spectrum is so wide, very difficult. And so it's worth thinking about the sort of space where you make a piece of work. And we find that if we are amongst stuff and materials, it's a very vital starting point. In a sense, I think we really genuinely don't know what we're doing. And inhabiting that state of the unknown is sort of vital to us. I was thinking very much about our backgrounds. I grew up, my dad was a naval engineer and my mum was a telephonist. And I grew up in an environment of people cooking, dressmaking, repairing fences. My dad became a plumber when he came out of the Navy. So I grew up in an environment of sort of manual capability. And what Ewan and I have discovered, particularly as we work in higher education, people quickly discount those sort of common held skills that they had growing up. So they may have worked on a farm and they got the cows in every morning. They may have been a member of a brass band, or they may have helped their parents in a shop, or they may have worked with relatives in a carpenter's workshop. Or they may have been head of the baton twirling within a sort of pageant group or a cheerleader or something like that. But as they go through school and they get immersed in a sort of knowledge economy.
Chris, you dropped out for me there now, so I hope I'm not talking over you. So I'll just come in there as a little bit silent. We're looking at an image here, which is from a show called The Curriculum, which we made 20 odd years ago now, 1999 I think it was, at Froebel College at the old Roehampton Institute, which is now Roehampton University, with Chris and I, our research fellows. And we want to show this. As Chris mentioned, we're not great at starting projects are quite sort of difficult. And if you put Chris and I in a studio with 2 chairs and 2 notepads and time, almost certainly absolutely nothing will happen. And we've discovered over the years that the way we approach the work there has to be what we would call a displacement activity of some kind. And because of that, the projects often start with a big make. The curriculum was when we made the project in Roehampton, there was a sort of period of research, and we were looking through the library at one point, and we came across a little handbook for I don't know if those of you know that Roehampton started out mainly as an institute for teaching teachers. So most of the books were on education, and there was a little hardback book with a red cover called Constructing a Curriculum. And of course we didn't bother reading the book, but we liked the title so much that we thought we would go and construct our own curriculum. We started to imagine what that might be. And what we find is, I just move that slide on, we find that the process of making something allows us to start thinking and allows us to start speaking with each other about what this particular commission or show or event or installation might be. And we often don't start talking about it until we start making something. And we find that the process of very involved making, where you're sitting and you're sawing and you're nailing, or you're doing whatever you need to do to build a structure, that's the sort of environment where you have the conversations about what might we be doing here? What might this be about? Why are we making this thing? Is this going to be a place where we might, is an audience actually going to sit in this, or are we making something that's going to be looked at from a distance? These things are all, this is the way in which we try and do these big makes early on, that allows us to, the work to slowly emerge, but also there is activity. It can be kind of quite a frightening process for producers who often want to know what the shows are going to be about. But in many ways, the making sort of has to come first, and it has to sort of stand in, and then after that we can start to imagine how we might inhabit these spaces. I was going to just talk very briefly about, we do have a sort of fascination with wood as a main material, really, and over the years we've made many structures out of just bare timber, bare batten or this kind of thing, often unpainted. Most of our structures are unfinished. In many ways, most of our images and perhaps most of our shows are also unfinished. But for a while, I had a small bit of woodland in Kent, where a lot of the projects started because it was a good sort of outdoor studio space where Chris and I could meet. It was also a good storage space where remnants of art could go, and but it was also basically a kind of, it's where shows started organically as growing things that we could cut and transform into objects for shows. It was when we first started talking about this as something called a generative performance, to sort of start to have a raw material as a theatre maker is not something we did. We weren't potters who had clay, or painters who had canvas and oil paints. We craved a sort of a material of some kind. So for a while we used these this chestnut coppice as a kind of generative site from which work could emerge. So yeah, this was a little gate hurdle that we used for a show called Middle English, which was really about a particular period of British architecture that was kind of in the 1930s and 40s, where British architecture was kind of caught between a sort of vernacular traditional approach to buildings and an exciting form of international modernism which was emerging in continental Europe. And we were fascinated by that. We called this period for our show Middle English, and we explored this idea of different a sort of a change of language, really, a sort of transition in language, in this case in architectural language. But again, we started by making hurdles, because we were interested in the idea of the academic hurdle, or the examination. Again, this is a project, as I was trying to explain, our projects tend to generate each other. So from the curriculum in '99, I think that Middle English happened in 2003, and again it was a sort of exploration. It was connected in some ways to ideas of educational achievement that had started there and during the project, the curriculum. And so, yeah, again, making hurdles became a thing that we did. It was a sort of, this is an example. Actually, I don't have the text with me, but for example, we were making these hurdles and we were also reading excerpts of John Ruskin's The Elements of Drawing, and we found that while we were making these hurdles, we were writing a series of texts. And what we found was, while Chris and I were talking, while we were building, we would be having these quite sort of extended discussions, often with lots of gaps in between them, but we were sort of, as the ideas were forming. But at the same time, when we came back to them in a show, we would find that we would almost represent these conversations. We found that the dialogues that we were having were more interesting than sort of dramatic dialogues. They were almost like we were restaging things that we were discovering through making. I'm going to speed on a little bit because I can see that we're time is moving on. Chris, if you can hear me and you want to jump in, please feel free to do so. Just cut me out, but I'll keep going just in case you're still not connected. I don't know if people recognize these sort of crenellations of this is at the base of the tower Bankside Power Station, now the Tate Modern. Tate Modern, Bankside, I beg your pardon, was designed by the architect Giles Gilbert Scott, and this is the architecture I was just describing when I was talking about the term Middle English. And again, when we were looking at this site, this architect, we were looking at this drawing, and to me immediately it looked like what I called smocked brickwork, i.e. it was a large face of bricks, which perhaps another kind of architect might have been brave enough to just do a complete face of bricks, but Scott felt the need to decorate in some way, and he put these, what I would call like pleats, they're like textile pleats in the building to kind of break up the monotony of an industrial building. And I show the photo only because by looking at that, and you can imagine Chris and I at the bottom of the tower chatting away about the idea of pleats, and we then decided what we should do was start exploring smocking. So, and when I say smocked brickwork, smocking, for those of you that don't know, I live with a textile designer, so these terms are kind of normal to me, but smocking is when you gather material very tightly together. And you can perhaps see, here's an image from the show Middle English. This is the actor Patrick Driver, who played a kind of, he played a sort of St. George type character, I suppose, in the final part of the show. And he wore this smocked garment. So the smocking is the little gathered part in the center of the chest and around the sleeves, which was really a way of gathering materials together, A, to strengthen it, and B, to it adds sort of warmth, but also a smocked garment has huge amounts of flexibility to it. So again, just this thing from looking at a building, we found that we needed to go away and make these things. So again, we weren't really talking about what this image might be ultimately, this final part of this show. We just thought, well, we would go back and we would experiment with making some smocked, some agricultural smocks. This was sort of agricultural wear from the 19th century. So yeah, these I'm trying to sort of explain the ways in which quite random connections between things result in made experiments or small technical projects. I mean, I think a lot of people assume that when we make our larger shows that we sit down and we write the show, we write out how it's going to be and what characters are going to be in it, or what sort of narrative there's going to be in it, if there is going to be a narrative. But it doesn't really work like that. We find ourselves getting very distracted by these small making projects. So yeah, that was an example of how making kind of impacts early on in the project. I'm going to spin through. These are more projects from. This is more part of. We'll move on into this shot, because again, this is a kind of example of, again, how not only the made objects become really important in the shows, but also the practice of making. We often just present it in the show as well. I mean, we found that the making of things well, or when you're with people who know how to do things well, these are some of the most engaging moments of performance, when you watch somebody who is skilled in something. I mean, as you can see from that photograph, where neither Chris or I are particularly skilled in anything, but when you watch somebody who really knows what they're doing, it is as engaging as watching, some gripping drama or whatever. So again, we make stuff for the shows. We translate the dialogues that come out of that making into a form of text for a show, and we also demonstrate. We then transplant the making itself into the show. And in Middle English, unoriginally, we made gate hurdles in front of people, and that was quite enjoyable for an audience because they experienced the smell of the sapwood of chestnut being split in front of them and then being stripped. As you can see there, Chris is stripping the bark away. And again, just to try and explain how these projects sort of bleed into one another. Again, this was a project in 2004. This is the installation Transmittery, which is quite a large scale installation commissioned for the centenary of Liverpool Anglican Cathedral, and Chris and I sort of took up residence in the caravan in the background there. But again, you see the first thing that arrives are a set of chestnut rods, which, and I suppose looking at that photograph, I think, you know, it was unfinished business. Okay, Liverpool Anglican Cathedral was also designed by Charles Gilbert Scott, so there was an architectural connection with it. But we felt like we needed to bring these things with us. It felt like unfinished business from the other show, Middle English, that needed to be re-explored in the installation in Liverpool. We worked with a set of steeplejacks from Blackburn who came up to help us put this structure onto the top of the crown of the bells, if you like, in the top of the ringing chamber at Liverpool Anglican Cathedral. I don't know if any of you are familiar with that cathedral, but it has the most spectacular ringing chamber. And the idea for this project really was to create a new kind of transmission from the bell tower. So the bell tower was to communicate with the city and to communicate from the cathedral to the city. And our idea was that we would broadcast a new form of broadcast from the tower. So we installed a small radio transmitter, and we created a kind of sound installation that could be picked up on medium wave radios across the city. But you could also visit the installation, and one of the ideas was we would try and build this classic kind of transmitter and place it on the top of the concrete structure which holds the bell. So you can see people installing it here, and we were if I go back here, we were making these things outside, and we were kind of building the structures here, getting people to install them, and then finally it would work. It would be open to the public. And you can see in the foreground of this shot here, I don't know if you can see my cursor on that screen, but on the shot on the right there, you can see the gate hurdles have come back and are part of this project, or making some connection with that. Before we move on to this next project, I just wanted to mention one of the problems that we found, because we're what's called site-specific artists. When you find a site, especially if it's an outdoor site, we're going to move on to quite a large outdoor project that we did in Berlin in 2007. One of the problems with site-specific work is that it's almost always, when it's outdoors, it's very hard to become visible or to make a kind of impact for an audience. I mean, well-designed architecture does, it sort of makes the rules of how it's interpreted. It sort of sets the agenda for how one experiences it, how one walks through it, how one sees it, how one lives in it, all of those kind of things. So if you're going to make, as we planned to do, if you're going to make an event in a striking piece of architecture, then you also need to make bold interventions. And so these kind of bare wood structures, a bit like just quickly, sorry, I'm jumping around, but these bare wood structures we found they tend to stand out. They're like sort of sketches in the landscape. This project was done on the Hufeisensiedlung in Berlin. It's a 1930s housing estate built by the architect Bruno Taut, and it's called the Hufeisen, which means horseshoe, because it was in a horseshoe shape, and in the center of it is this sort of teardrop pond. And when we got there, we found that it was a sort of, it had almost been built as an auditorium for something. It felt like it was a site expectant of an event. And we came across this photograph of a sort of topping out ceremony they haven't quite finished the outer part of the estate, but Taut is here in the middle. I think he's the one in the trilby hat in the front here. But we love the performativity of this beautiful kind of sort of almost pagan structure on the roof of this modernist block that was being built, and these fantastic figures sitting up in the roof with this guy in the top hat looking down, sort of celebrating the sort of performativity of what they were doing, and that kind of inspired us. We thought, well, if we're going to work here, we can't just sort of make a thing just because it looks like an auditorium. We can't just make a show in it. We need to make proper interventions. And one of the things that we built was this Japanese torii, which is really a torii is a sort of sacred gateway, really, or a threshold that you might cross to go into a particular place. And we found that this was really the only way that we could deal with this this site, because it was an incredibly beautiful place. We needed these really bold. We needed these sort of bold interventions. So we made this strange Japanese torii. I mean, the reason for it, the background to it, was that Bruno Tant spent quite a lot of time in Japan and was very interested in Japanese architecture, and we felt we could bring something of that back. But you can see here the technical team from the Hebel Theatre, sort of helping us build it. And there was a real kind of anxiety, I think, at How, which was these guys seem to they're just making things and putting them in the site, and yet, you know, there's a show to be made. We've already advertised it, and there's no sign of it. And again, I mean, here's a version. Here's an element from the live event. I'll just see if I can find where we're using okay, I'll just skip ahead a little bit here. So here's a scene from the show we made. It was called Die Erde eine gute Wohnung, which is the earth, a good apartment, I beg your pardon. And you can see here, there's a character here, is a German actor. He is doing a sort of narration, and in many ways it illustrates the problem, really, because we were so fascinated by this torii and how it would focus people's attention on the bamboo raft that we built in the middle of the lake, and how it lined up with one of the gateways coming into the estate. And we really never thought about how we could use it in performance, and in the end we came up with this really rather unoriginal idea of having somebody standing underneath it talking. And I think this is a problem Chris and I have had with a lot of our shows. Is really we're working often too long on a level of making things, and we're not really thinking carefully enough about how the actual performance sort of integrates with them. So that was a slight fail on our part. But this, I'll just go back here. What I mean about having a bold intervention, we built this bamboo raft, and you can see us pushing it into position there on the raft. And the beautiful thing about this was the building of the raft, and the getting it into position, and the floating it on various things to make it work. And there was a little jetty and stuff. And all the time the estate is inhabited and people are watching it. There's a long lead-in, a long prelude to the work. And sometimes the making is a way in which people can interact with the project before it comes. You know, you're walking your dog through the Hufeisensiedlung and you're saying, what is it you're making on the raft? Why is this lorry full of bamboo arrived? What do you do? And I think sometimes that's a really nice thing, because you can bed in slowly and gently to a place where people are going to come and watch. And then obviously in the event, people come out from the apartments and just sit, like as if they were having a barbecue. They just come out and sit and watch this event. And it didn't really need advertising. It sort of advertised itself. Yeah. So again, you know, in the end, we went to an awful lot of effort just to make a stage. But it was great fun to make, and it's a beautiful thing to walk around on. And yeah, so we had a little orchestra here of handbell ringers from Berlin, and characters arrived by boat, and you can see people sitting on the lawn there. It's almost like a small amateur performance, really. This is I wanted to talk a little bit about, as well as making, we wanted to talk about the idea of repair and recovery of objects. This is part of the installation from 2013 at Somerset House, called Plant Science, and it was a commission to work in the old plant science laboratories, semi-derelict in Herne Hill on Half Moon Lane. And so Chris and I spent a year there just basically going through what was technically a building that had been vacated by a university, and we worked really with the remnants of what was left, what was considered not worth salvaging. And I suppose the key structure there was this rather beautiful Hartley 10 glass house, sort of proper botanical glass house. And you can see here that it was in pretty bad state when we got there. Most of the glass had gone, and it was kind of filled with various bits of old furniture and things like that, and it was all a bit rotten. But we decided we would try and take it apart and reconfigure it in the gallery space, and we, along with other elements, you can see the building in the background, and we brought out as well a series of lab benches that we found from an abandoned laboratory there. I mean, what was interesting about this project was this is the site of Nobel Prize winning research, Sir James Black's work into beta blockers for heart conditions, and this was done in this. Chris and I found it quite extraordinary that this place of such incredible sort of historic significance could be just abandoned in some way. I mean, it happens all the time because universities procure places for new things to happen and they walk away from old places. But we found that kind of intriguing. And while we were there, we became really interested in the lab bench, which was reawakened again when we came to you at Wimbledon. We realised that as theatre makers, we never really felt like we had much apparatus to work with. We were often given empty rooms to make images in or shows in or that kind of thing, or the idea that for performance and theatre you just need a space to do it in. But what we found was working with these lab benches and taking them apart and then putting them back together again, we thought to ourselves, yeah, why don't we get close to materials like this? What would happen if we had access to this kind of thing? And there's there was, in fact, what I might do is I might the show Plant Science was set up as an auction, or a fake auction, if you like. So everything in every gallery space, it covered 13 rooms in Somerset House, and every room had artifacts that we'd found in the building, as if they were for sale. Here's the little catalogue that we produced for it. So it had all sorts of things like fire buckets and eye wash stations and towel dispensers and this kind of thing. But the catalogue also had within it a series of short essays, and I will just read you a very quick part of one of them, if that's okay. So we wrote, under laboratory benches, we said, the lab bench incorporates a series of subtle design elements that mark it out as apparatus for active learning. Designed principally to stand behind rather than to sit at, it presupposes that study, learning or experiment should be undertaken on the move. Whereas the desk encourages static concentration, scaled to allow for the dimensions of the leg bent at the knee and the upper body supported on flattened forearms, the bench, with its height, depth and mass, sets up a subtly different environment for study. The laboratory student or researcher must progress towards understanding by actively attending to material in a variety of ways: heating, rinsing, cleansing, slicing, magnifying, a form of secular altar service in the pursuit of enlightenment. Just as the saw marks on a carpenter's bench reassure and encourage an apprentice joiner, let me just bring the lab benches back up for you to see. Just as the saw marks on a carpenter's bench reassure and encourage an apprentice joiner anticipating the challenge of intricate fretwork or jointing, so the discoloration of scalds and stains on the lab bench, the chips, the burns of previous experiment, embolden the researcher to take ever greater risks, and remind her that she works as part of a continuum of discovery on which she too at some point will be required to leave her mark. The lab bench, I just bring this photograph up. This is an illustration we had in one of the rooms by the illustrator Belinda Worsley. And we were looking at the way in which the lab bench, the three types of learning that could be done at a lab bench. So I finish very briefly with this. It says the lab bench is a charged apparatus, a workplace with sinew, pneuma and circulation, and its solidity and scale encourage three pedagogical relationships. Number one, which is on the left, is transverse, across the bench, or discursive. Number two is obverse, facing the bench, collaborative. And number three is adverse, turning against the bench, antagonistic or polemical. So that was plant science, and again, out of the apparatus of the installation, it did start to make us think a little bit about the environment of learning and how we, or the environment for making, and the apparatus that we have as theatre makers, the tools, etc., that we'd have, which brings us neatly to the installation we made with you recently. This is the installation that we made most recently with you at Wimbledon, Trig Point. Some of you might have seen that, and again, we set ourselves a big make relating to the creation of these concrete navigation trigs. You may have come across these if you're a walker. The idea was we wanted to try and realign the college by making these trigs line up, find new ways in which the college might accommodate performance. It was when the new performance and acting courses started at Wimbledon. So yeah, again, we started with the process of casting. Chris, in fact, actually did the majority of it, a lot of it in his kitchen and bathroom. Do a lot of the makes in the domestic sphere rather than in the studio. And we created these concrete trigs around the college. There was a map that you could follow as well to try and navigate your way around the different spaces, or spaces that you might not have necessarily come across. And I suppose this is the equivalent of, Chris showed you his dad's shed, and this was Chris's. He borrowed a friend's studio for the majority of his casting, and in many ways it doesn't look dissimilar to his father's shed. By the time he'd finished, he had these small molds for casting trigs all around his house, and he was totally obsessed with them at that point. We have some shots of tools, and that might just open up a whole new more dimension.
Thanks, Ewan. I think yeah, that'd be a great kind of launch just to pick up on a few things that you brought to light there. I wondered if you could unpack a little bit about the making space as a type of rehearsal, especially with that the Japanese piece. And the bamboo raft. There's a real sense of kind of anticipation and process through making. But maybe you could talk a little bit about the kind of, that connection between making and forming the design for the production, and then actually the process of making being some sense of rehearsal in progress for the actual final piece, as it were.
Sure. I mean, you've described it really, really well, really. I mean, that is, I mean, the Bruno Taut project in Berlin was quite unusual for us because we were given very, very good facilities. We were given a workshop to work in on the estate itself. It was an old butcher's shop, actually, that was unoccupied in one of the quarters of the estate. So we had a place to sort of sit and start the process of making. We brought in various people to help us, because obviously, depending on the scale of the project, I mean, we like to give the impression that we make absolutely everything, but we can't. And so often we will bring in other makers and people to come in and work to a particular brief. So the Tory, for example, we started out together, but in the end it was taken on by an architect friend of ours, Robbie, and he sort of spent 3 weeks shut away making this thing for us. And I suppose the process is that once you start these makes, I think the bamboo raft was a fascinating one because it took an awful long time to get customs clearance, to get the bamboo which we bought in China. This was a long residency, so we arrived in Berlin the autumn before the project, and we'd done various sort of site visits and things like that. So we were starting to think this is what we will need, and then for a time, perhaps from, I think it's sort of like from mid-February to early March, we took up residency in an estate nearby, in Gropiusstadt, which is in Neukölln in Berlin. And again, we were sort of living in this rather surreal kind of empty high-rise flat, modernist flat, with virtually no furniture. And again, we're kind of pacing around trying to start to sort of draw up plans for how we might build these things. And again, we're coming across lots of logistical problems, again, because the German theatre industry is very it's incredibly efficient and very regulated, and it's very easy to work with. But we found that the normal production process for the How Theatre were very fast in terms of how we wanted to work. So there wasn't time to sort of dwell so much with the material. I think Chris and I would have loved to have sort of spent a few weeks building the bamboo raft. I think we even had an idea, rather idealistic idea, that we could float a bamboo raft like a proper bamboo raft, like floated using its own buoyancy, and we're going to try this. But what we found was a lot of those things were sort of taken out of our hands very quickly. A technical engineer had come in and had already sort of said that we needed to buy sort of floating pontoons, and there was a drawing so there were tensions, but in a way this is the wonderful sort of messiness of making theatre, for me anyway, is you find yourself, okay, so this is the process for this one. There are a lot of other people involved. We're not going to be able to shut ourselves away and slowly let the show emerge. This one's going to be one where we're going to have to compromise a little bit on that and on this. And so yeah, there were some elements in that which perhaps interrupted a little bit of what we were doing. But then it was of a scale where we perhaps had to have that work. But you talk about how the Tory came about and that decision to do it. Those things are never difficult for us to know what it is that we might try and place in the. I'm trying to find a way of explaining it. For a while, I was living on a boat in London, and we read regularly, because we moved the boat quite a lot. We would regularly have to have its compass adjusted. So every year, because it was a steel boat, I would take a compass adjuster who was an old friend, and we would go down the river to Margaret Ness, which is sort of south east of London, and there's a section there where there are various buildings that are known to the compass adjuster, and you basically turn the boat 360 degrees several times, and as we pass each point, the compass adjuster looks at what your compass is saying, and he adds various metallic kind of blocks around where your compass is set, which is sort of just trying to adjust it. If you're a little bit out to the east, he puts a thing in here and whatever. And I think that's how I would sort of describe how we use these large wooden structures on a site. They're a little bit like trying to realign the site. If we don't have huge amounts of money, and we're a very big company, it's just me and Chris. So in order to realign a site, or in order to make a bold intervention, we have to choose very particular kind of structure, something that is simple but very bold and very beautiful. And it might just align two things that people who live there hadn't seen before, or it might trigger an association in an audience member that will make them look differently at an otherwise interesting site. This is sort of what we were doing, and I felt it also when we were at Wimbledon. We very deliberately, we were placing the concrete trigs in spaces on tables. I think I have a shot here somewhere of one of the little ones. People might have come across it, but we were placing these things. And I suppose what we had in our mind was that we were trying to sort of slightly reconfigure this building somehow by placing these things, that we might reconfigure the sort of magnetic field of how you navigated around this site.
I think you've touched upon just thinking through almost like I guess it's a good question of where does the performance start, and you're really starting it right from the beginning. It's kind of interesting, this kind of a cumulative effect of this production, really from the get-go, and this kind of tautology of how things inform each other. And Colin has just put in the chat there, he says stirs ideas at a particular project on material affordances, or the quality or property of an object that defines its possible uses and makes clear how it can or should be used. So almost thinking as if you're proposing how things will unfold even before you know they're unfolding, with allowing things to sort of happen. There's a certain amount of decisive action, but then also allowing the making process to then inform what's next. And I guess Colin's question is, I wonder if engagement or performance with these materials, or you alluded to like the performance perhaps not leaning to exactly where you intended with the Japanese gateway. Has engagement or performance with or engagement with your productions kind of surprised you, or kind of put you completely off thinking how people would actually engage?
I suppose sometimes yes. I think I'm looking back at these projects. I'm thinking perhaps at the time I haven't realised, but I'm looking back at some of them and I'm thinking, maybe we focused too much on this at that point, or we didn't focus enough on that at that point, and that way perhaps doing those things. I don't mind. I think I was talking before the talk with Chris about, I mentioned that we very rarely finish. We're very bad at finishing work, and neither of us, I think, like finishing objects, which perhaps marks us out from different types of makers. The process is never about finishing. In fact, so often finishing is a bit of a disappointment, and perhaps we're often sort of feeling like, I see the structures or the objects that we make as kind of sketches. They're like pencil sketches, so they're not going to damage something because they can be erased. I mean, the curriculum, for example, this structure was kind of eradicated in about 20 minutes by the estates team as soon as we'd finished, because it was in the so. And in a way, the temporary nature of those things is sort of their charm, is the fact that you could, just for a moment, you could gather 30 people on gym benches to enter into the conceit that they're in a building, even though they're in just a skeletal kind of structure. That was an intriguing thing. I mean, while you were asking me the question, I was thinking about a railway we built one time, which again was a complete sort of non sequitur. We started to build this sort of wooden railway. I think we'd got some wheels, and we built a kind of trackway, like a bit like a film dolly that would allow a trolley to kind of go up and down it. But we really had absolutely no idea what we were going to do with it. And in the end, we did sort of use it. But again, it sort of, I suppose it allowed us to start something. I don't know what we were exactly working out, what we were thinking. I think it was a section of the show called The Tracking Shot or something like that. And we were going to build this sort of, well, we're going to put a character on it or a performer on it and push them. And there was something about it. But I remember making the thing, and I remember the sort of childlike enjoyment of making something like that. And then feeling a little bit sort of guilty about the fact that we'd sort of done it in a public performance and hadn't really worked out properly what we were gonna do with it. So yeah, we are a little bit out of sync on those things sometimes, but isn't that is sort of part of the fun of making? They're like speculative proposals. They're almost like antagonisms that you put in this landscape to see what might happen. What if we install this thing? What might happen? What might it interrupt? I suppose is the thing. And then as a theatre maker, you can step back and you can go, right, well, what's going on here? What actually is? I see what this structure has done to this particular environment, how people are now looking at it or using it or talking about it or whatever. So now we've got a context in which to make a small momentary event in it. I don't know if I hope that makes some sort of
Yeah,
sense.
no, it definitely does. And I think it sort of leads me to my other question was going back to thinking through the apparatus and the science benches. I absolutely
Yeah.
loved that. If you could ping me the bit that you read out, that would be brilliant, just to kind of meditate on as someone who runs a workshop with benches. I think it would be great just to meditate on that text. But there was something in there in terms of thinking about what is the apparatus for the theatre maker. And at Wimbledon, we're obviously geared towards thinking about making towards performance, or creating performance itself, or creating the sets or the environment that holds the performance. And you sort of alluded to the fact of, like, as theatre makers, we don't necessarily have apparatus. You get given these empty rooms, and I wondered if you had any proposals for people who are thinking. I mean, obviously we've got a room that is mostly with people working around performance and tech arts and theatre design, or production arts for screen, but we also have Colin joining us from Camberwell thinking about spatial design. But I would say, I guess my question is, what is your suggestion for apparatus that can kind of archive the marks of the maker or the performance maker for
Yes.
that kind of history of making? Is that the theatre, or is that the workshop, or is that the studio?
It's bench is what you're asking. Yeah. I mean,
Yeah, what's the bench? Yeah.
I think I'm sort of, I'm kind of, I'm searching for something that and I don't know the answer to it. I mean, all I know is that, and I don't want to speak too generally about it, because it might be just me, or it might just be me and Chris. But I find often the emptiness of theatre studio problematic, and I sometimes it's great, but often I find that sort of it throws me back on myself. And it basically, the empty studio for me says you're the resource. Okay, you come here and there's nothing to interrupt. It's all about your idea and your ideas and what you want to realize, and there's everything else is erased. It's all painted the same color, and the lights are kind of hidden away, but we can make the light without you seeing the lamp that's making the light. And it may just be me, my own personality, but I find that terrifying. and I think there might be some, and I'm really interested in exploring it, and I'm interested in joining up with other people who might be able to help Chris and I explore what is the apparatus that I mean, I don't know, I know you saw the performance lecture that we did with Trig Point, which was called On the Hoof, and I spent some time ruminating on the idea of banked, sort of velodrome type banked sides to studios that might help sort of invigorate or energize image makers, because there was something to play with in the space. So that was one thing. Whether it's just in the design of the studio, it's just whether or not we could ever get away from the oblong block that is kind of there to isolate the pure image in the middle of the space. I suppose the purity thing is why Chris and I have always ended up moving out of spaces and looking for other places, and looking at architectural sites that seem to be inviting a performance or whatever. I think there's something about the kind of the messiness or engaging the problematic with the problematic of the space, that it feels like that's a starting point for theatre making.
And Chris, probably we're probably coming into land, because we've just hit 4 o'clock. But I just wanted to ask about, we've chatted before about how making can put us into a posture for other types of thinking, and we might have some performers or contemporary actors in the room, and I just wondered if you could chat about, what's the benefits of taking up a making process in order to somewhat kind of feed another motion of or another activity such as acting?
The thing I would say is that making certainly solo making. I mean, Chris and I make together a lot of time, but we also make apart because we're working on things in separate sort of places. I think the dialogue that goes on, or the monologue, I suppose, if you're on your own, or the dialogue with yourself while you're making something, or while you're learning to make something. You don't even have to be particularly good at doing it, going through those processes. That it takes the pressure off a little bit. You're not having to think creatively, because the creativity is coming through the thing that you're doing with your hands or whatever it is that you're actually making. But you're making these associations between things, and you're thinking about larger projects through the process of repeatedly, whatever it is, folding paper. I made a show in Glasgow with some students up there, where we made a paper, folded, a sort of origami city in a large space, and we had to fold hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of paper buildings. And I remember sitting with groups of these are students on a course called Contemporary Theatre Practice, and we would sit long into the evening. Now often when I teach, students are great, they're engaged, they're in the space, but as soon as we hit 5 o'clock, they're gone and they're out of there and they're off, whatever. But when we were making this, we found ourselves just folding paper together in silence for hours on end, just doing this thing, and there was sort of kind of strange kind of contentment about it. And I think it's a really nice activity if you're doing an ensemble work with people, that you can dwell somewhere together, especially without speaking, but doing something together. You're still finding a way that the project or the show or the image that you're working on is developing, even though nothing is being spoken about, because something is being made. Another example would be a beautiful sort of structure we made one time out of old chapel chairs that we found when we stacked them on top of each other. They sort of all interlocked with each other, and we could make these enormous, tall structures, quite dangerous structures, that were strong enough almost to climb up and put more chairs on. And again, I could sort of sense there was a certain joy in the students' faces, the fact that they were all involved in this thing, and there was no sort of specialism involved. It was just this collective activity of making this sort of structure until some point, kind of where it fell apart. And that process actually we then went back and we talked about it in the bar and whatever. And we translated that then into an image in the show, which was a much more structured thing. But it felt like everyone was invested in that image because they'd been part of making it from the start, rather than having a production designer or something saying, okay, well, we'll make the tower out of a set of chairs, and if everyone stays out of the way until that's made, and then you can just block yourself in and mark the floor showing where you want to be. It's just a different sort of process. It's about having agency, your material.
It's an amazing place to stop, I think. But just loads to unpack in terms of just thinking of the benefits of making as a process, as a thinking process. I think it's just such a brilliant picture of the richness that can happen when we're engaging with materials, engaging with process, engaging with prototyping. So I just wanted to thank you for sharing. I'm so sorry Chris dropped out. It would have been so good to have him in the call. But just as a last thing, you did create a podcast, didn't you? Thinking about your reflections or gathering reflections on your time at Wimbledon. And I wondered if, are they open to the public? Is there some sort of link where people can grab them yet?
They're going to be available through the new website, but the new website is behind.
Yeah, that would be absolutely brilliant. I think Adrian Kerr and I think a few others contributed to that in terms of just thinking through how we reflected on how you guys helped us see through, or just almost to be a mirror to our practice. I think that was super helpful for us, and it might be really interesting for people to to watch. If you're based at Wimbledon as a student or tutor, do have a walk around the site. The wonderful trigs are still around. I helped Chris and Ewan move this massive one around the corner around the new acting studios. So if you ever want a nice, quiet, solace place to hide out, there's a wonderful, massive, massive trig just around that corner. Just to say thank you so much again, Ewan. That was brilliant, and I could talk to you guys for absolute ages. But we'll call it a day there. Thank you very much for joining us today.